a short sleeve because underneath that robe, things get a little
Yeah.
warm,
Yeah.
especially in this warmer weather.
Okay, welcome to Science Sunday. We've got a nice crowd here. Thanks for coming out. And we invited our Reverend Mandy Huizinga to come and talk with us about this topic again today too. So thanks so much for being here and at home. Another nice day of Science Sunday. The weather is probably going to break soon, but not quite yet. We always want to thank the DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church for supporting Science Sunday, not just physically by giving us a space and the great technicians up there and the microphones and so on, but the psychological support they give us too as we go on a search for truth and meaning and look at science topics. And we feel very welcome here that the things we're doing are appreciated and supported by the church. So that's important to us too. So other than that, we want to get started, and it's nice to have like-minded participants. And we're talking about awe and wonder in science. We thought it was a great concept to bring Reverend Mandy in and have her thoughts about it all too. So we're trying to make this more conversational, free-flowing. We'd like to have comments from the home people. Scott can monitor that in some regards if there's some questions or comments from at home, and also questions and comments from the crowd, so that everyone at home can hear and everyone here can hear. We should pass around the microphone there, and maybe Joanne will be the dispenser of the microphone. The microphone goddess that will hand things out when we're ready, when people are ready to talk. So if you have a comment, you can raise your hand and we'll go on from there. So we're trying to keep it free-flowing and open-minded and so on. And it's a wonderful topic. It is interesting to me that really much of science for quite a while studied, when it studied the emotions, it studied maybe negative emotions like pain and suffering and, you know, guilt and different things like that. And actually there's been more study in the last 15 years in the scientific community of the positive emotions and of maybe pride and goodwill and communicability and different things like that. And one is the sense of awe and wonder. And the more I looked into it, it's interesting. I wanted to preface it all by saying that Darwin actually talked about emotions early on, and not only did we evolve our fingers and toes and brains and things like that, but in Darwin's writings, he talked about the development of human emotions as well too. And it's not as well regarded or talked about or thought about as much, but his concept was that just like with fingers and toes, the capabilities that we have in our bodies, the capabilities that have evolved in our brains, the emotions that we display, are also supportive of our progression as a species, have been important for our sustainability and so on. And so there's some talk I hope to get into later about what does awe really do, and I wanted to have us talk about some of that. What is the purpose of awe? If we have purposes for an opposable thumb, according to Darwin, we have purposes for all the emotions that we've developed, you know, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nerve responses and so on too. So with some of that, I thought I'd start out asking if you have some kind of an idea, throw it open for a topic of what is awe and wonder the same thing? Just some level baseline talk about the purposes and awe and wonder, what it is.
Yeah, about sums it up, I think.
Oh, wow. I would say that awe and wonder are two different things. Awe kind of leaves me in a place when I feel awe of kind of an enraptured place. Does that make sense? Whereas wonder is just, wonder doesn't feel as mysterious to me as awe does. Does that make sense? Wonder is curiosity based. It's a beautiful sunset, right? I know how that works. Scientifically, naturally, I know how a sunset works, and it gives me wonder. But awe is something that might not actually have at least an explanation that we at this particular moment in time can explain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it goes beyond, it transitions beyond what is in your zone of understanding, right? That doesn't mean there's not an understanding or an explanation, and maybe 30 other people down the street have that understanding, but for you, it's a very personal thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think awe is a large part of it is a sense of surprise turned up to 11, right? That you're just overcome by something that seems unexpected or unanticipated or previously unimagined. So I think awe has a strong element of surprise to it, but also other positive emotions. On the other hand, I think you said exactly what I was thinking about wonder being tied into the concept of curiosity. I think curiosity turned up to 11, and perhaps even there's a tincture of satisfied curiosity there as well, right? When you discover something that you were previously curious about, that sense of satisfaction in understanding may also be wonder. But I think the concept of understanding and curiosity are tied more closely into wonder, as you intimate.
I'd agree.
Wonder has some level of intellectual property to it, I think, almost, that you're setting a task and maybe trying to explain it, finding the imbalance right now that's there because you haven't explained it yet, but feeling maybe the level of comfort or confidence that you can or someone can help you with that. So yeah, I think when we say wonder and awe, it's interesting. I think probably until I started thinking about it, I didn't really set a tone or say a difference between the two, that this awe is something beyond it. I do have a definition which tends to fit in. An emotional response to physically or conceptually extraordinary stimuli that challenge our normal day-to-day reference and are not already integrated into our understanding of the world. So there's a two-part aspect of it. First, it's something that's something extraordinary, something that catches your attention for whatever reason that may be. But beyond that, that you can't simply or easily kind of compartmentalize it, put it in a place that it's comfortable for you. It's something that shocks and staggers you in some ways, right?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about then, is there, what makes something awesome? Is it automatically awesome? Is it awesome to everyone? What's the individual aspect of awe?
Are you ready for comments?
Sure. We would like to have
Okay.
the microphone goddess hand you the,
I was just gonna add before we do the questions. I was just thinking about examples. I like examples of things, and I was thinking wonder. When I think about things that have been wonder filled in my life, I think about, like, for instance, the birth of my child. Like, that was wonder filled. I can explain the process, and yet it still is just beyond me, and that my body could actually give birth to a
Right.
being, right? Like, that is incredible. That is wonder filled. But I think about awe, and I think about not necessarily big moments, but 2 weeks ago was the anniversary of the passing of a dear friend of mine, Jim Birchall. And the first year, we used to garden together. That was our thing. He would garden and I would garden, and we would talk about life, and the kids would eat his fennel fronds, and he was a dear, dear, dear person in our lives. And the summer after his passing, I had a sunflower in my garden that grew larger than any sunflower I have ever seen. And the monarchs were just completely attracted to it. And I thought of Jim every time I was in the garden. There is no explanation for it, and it might have been completely coincidental. And that was an awe-filled moment to go into the garden and still feel like I was communing with Jim, with a sunflower and monarchs.
right?
In his presence, in the soil that he tended. So I was just thinking about physical examples of how wonder and awe appear in our lives, and for me that was an example. So I need something physical to attach myself to. Sorry.
Good.
Go ahead, Russ.
Hello.
Yes.
Are we on?
You're on.
Okay. The one thing I was looking for in the definition is it did say emotional response, which is great. But I was looking for the idea that awe borders on fear. Wonder does not. And the reason awe borders on fear is because the thing that puts us in awe is so much bigger than us. And unless we are in a safe place, like in the yard by the sunflower,
Right.
I get that. But if we're in an unfamiliar place and then we see something that inspires awe and we don't know what it is, we lose our bearings because it's, conceptually extraordinary, challenges our day to day. But wonder I would never equate with fear or even be bordered on fear.
There's things that can pass over, things can have levels of wonder and be awe-inspiring too. I mean, I think that it flows into each other to some extent as well too.
Yeah, but I would also add that actually when you go back to biblical texts, right, and you talk about the Jews going into the most holy temple, there is fear
Right.
that surrounds that. So to that same kind of concept, whether there is a God or not, there is this fear that is held in that place that people experience, and that is awe. Yeah, the unexplainable beyond our normal everyday
Or
today.
even if you're a peasant and you go into a medieval cathedral.
Right,
I'd be
Yes.
amazed. Oh my gosh, and all these pictures and,
right.
yeah. And I think that's what the church wanted.
Yeah, oh, probably.
We have a comment from online. Paul Stalnow says the key is that the sense of awe and wonder is in our heads and not in the thing that inspired it. So a blue whale or a galaxy or other things that may be awesome to behold, the feeling, that property of awesomeness is contained within us.
It's a human, possibly,
Right.
at least human, maybe other creatures,
Yeah.
but we don't know of awe in any other creature, I would think. And I was thinking that awe is very related to fear, at least for many years. I would say that the awesome things that were felt by primitive people living out when they saw fire for the first time, when they saw lightning strikes, when they saw an amazing sunset or things like that, I would say that there was most likely a lot of fear based in that too. And at what point did awe not automatically engage in fear? And I wanted to get into that in a bit too, and I think that you implied, I think that religion became an answer for those awesome things, right? And early religion seemed to base a lot of itself on developing or building on the awe, explaining the awe in some ways, right?
Yeah, getting it to make sense for people.
Making sense of it.
And I would actually add to that. Alejandro Garcia Rivera is an aesthetic theologian, so he writes about art. And he talks about how those first moments of awe are actually cave paintings,
Okay.
right? The idea that was trying to make sense of our world, even when it didn't quite make sense. So it's, that's the root of religion, right? That
right.
explanation.
So yeah, it seems like awe has a big part in religion, I guess, is
Yeah.
a big feeling on my
Do we have
part.
another question?
Yeah, I just want to make a couple comments, because it is strange to have wonder and awe, and it's usually awe brings on wonder, not wonder bringing on awe. So, I found awe to be basically what my brain can't comprehend initially.
Uh-huh.
So awe precedes wonder, you think?
Correct.
Okay.
And then I have a couple examples. I remember, I've seen a lot of the wonders of our country. But the time I actually looked out the first time over the Grand Canyon, my brain couldn't comprehend it. And it was just like, oh.
Yeah.
And the second time it was the same way, but now I can go up and look and, oh yeah, okay, there's this, there's the gutter.
It's no longer as
brain-
surprising.
Pardon?
It's no longer as surprising.
Right, it's not surprising, and I'm able to comprehend up here that, okay, it's the erosion, all this stuff, and wonder how this happened, and still wonder, but
And it seems like, I think religion likes to base their awe on, that continues, right? This awe doesn't leave. There is still an awesome God. There is still an awesome answer. Awe is still there. And in a modern society, we come up with more answers, right? There's more answers for why things are the way they are. We understand a rainbow. We understand a sunset. We understand terrible storms. And that isn't looking for that answer through religion. So I think awe is sometimes tough to maintain in our society as compared to what it may have been for 400, 800 years ago.
I might say that awe can often, especially as things become explained, becomes wonder. Awe might start, we evolve. And yet, there are some things that can be explained, like butterflies on sunflowers can be explained scientifically, and yet there's still awe there
Right.
because it's bigger than just that.
Right.
My friend Jim loved sunflowers. They were his favorite flowers. He would talk with our Irish neighbor about Irish writers who love sunflowers. Like there was a bigger connection for me than just the wonder piece. There was still awe in it. And so while I would say awe turns into wonder, there are still moments that are just awe-filled because we just cannot explain them.
Right.
I think as you were talking, one of the ideas that occurred to me is a related concept, at least in a religious context, of transcendence.
Yes.
And
Yep.
that's a concept that I have some struggle with. I think, for me, transcendence denotes a barrier, something we cannot expect to explain or get beyond. There's an aspect of the concept of transcendence that entails that for me. And I find that a challenging concept because from my naturalistic metaphysics that I maintain, I think everything has an explanation, even if it is awesome or overwhelming or in other ways spectacular.
Right. Well, in transcendence, it's the opposite of transcendence is immanence, right? The thing that's present with us. And going through theological school, this is one of the things they talk about, right? God is transcendent. He is above all. They are above all. But there are moments when God becomes imminent in our lives. The conception of Mary is one of those moments that's talked about as imminence. I hate the binary. It doesn't have to be either or. What if it's both? What if we can see? I think about Neil deGrasse Tyson's piece where he talks about how we are in and of the cosmos, right? That panentheism. Yes, that's both transcendent, beyond us, way above us, and yet it's here. The cosmos is right within us. The
We're
stardust
stardust,
in
yeah.
the bones, right? So I don't think we have to live into the binary. In fact, I refute it. I refuse.
I repudiate your binary.
Yes,
right?
I want all of it and
Yeah.
more. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We had,
Mary?
Yeah,
Oh, other way. Turn the microphone around. No,
You've got
flip it
it
over.
transcend. So what strikes me though is that, excuse me, I think awe has definitely an element of letting go. Letting go at some level, even though you're not aware. You might consciously be aware, but maybe not. So there's a letting go, at least at that moment, at that present moment of when the awe seems to be happening. And maybe it goes in, maybe at some point it changes into wonder, and maybe it never does, but you're open to it being whatever it is. And it's a very personal experience most of the time, I think, because we're all at different places as to where we're open and or closed or semi-open or learning or evolving, and all that stuff is going on as a human. So it just feels to me like the element of letting go is in there somewhere when we experience and how we see it, awe.
You can't contain the thoughts within you because they're just so vast and beyond it, I guess.
And you can't explain.
Right.
It's just your experience, the experience.
I've
of
seen
what-
some discussions in which awe is supposedly vast. It's vaster than ourselves. And I'm not sure, I guess you'd almost have to define what about it is vast. Is it vast spatially? Is it vast temporally? Is it, what is vast about it? And, a birth of a baby is again, you brought it back, and I think you were making the point that you saw it as a wonderful filled experience, but you were saying you didn't see it necessarily as awesome because it was pretty well explained, and all creatures that are alive, plants and animals, all, make babies and pass on genes and so on too, but it's still, I'm wondering if that means it can't be awesome, or
I think what I found awesome about giving birth is the actual individual, right? Like all of a sudden I have this being in my arms
yeah.
who is a person already. Like
Right.
even as a newborn baby, that being has personality. That was awesome.
Right.
But the actual act of birth is wonder-filled for me. But it's the other things. Like I can't explain how that child already has a personality. I know that scientifically there's probably reasons, blah, 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 but it doesn't make sense to me in the same way that birth
Right.
does.
yeah.
Does that make sense?
The brain neurons are being created and crafted way before that
Right.
baby's held in your arms.
Right.
But still, it seems awesome to me. It seems
Yes.
filled with awe to me.
Yeah.
And it's not just understanding the process of birth or something like
Right.
that. It's the creation of another being that you're going to be spending the rest of your life with.
In my first book, I write about the multiverse, and there are many scientists and others who write about the multiverse, but I added a part to that I think is often overlooked, and that's the human multiverse, right? That each of us has a model of everything we behold and know and aspire to and understand. Each of us has that in our own head, and every time you interact with another human being, you're interacting with another model of the universe. It's the similarities that allow us to find some concordance and communication, and it's the disparities that help enrich us.
I think it's helpful to consider like awe and wonder from the perspective of kind of like aesthetics. You know, kind of aesthetics is, yeah, kind of the overall human ability to, you know, consider things like this. You know, in psychology of, in particular, aesthetics is thought of the most complex aspect of our psychology, in the sense that it combines, you know, psychology is divided into intelligence, personality, and emotionality. And the aspect of this is that it really combines all of those abilities.
Are you saying aesthetics is a formal segment of psychology? It's studied as a formal sub-practice?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. As a, you know, a psychological ability,
Okay.
as aesthetics. And these things would seem to fall under aesthetics. And the interesting thing about aesthetics is that it's the most kind of considered the most complex aspect of psychology, in the sense that it combines all the different aspects of intelligence, emotionality, and personality.
I think awesomeness, this study of it hasn't really been a big field scientifically until maybe 15, 20 years ago. And there was a man, Dr. Keltner, who's, anytime you start reading about all the other people reference back to this guy, but he's from Berkeley, and he has a place, psychologist, the Greater Good Science Center. And so he's been studying, and the positive emotions, like I said earlier, haven't been studied that well, but he's kind of brought it to the fore. And even the positive emotions, that they start hooking, you know, diodes, different things up to people, and they check their responses to things. And it's been pretty interesting to see that usually you can see that there's a sympathetic nerve system and the parasympathetic nerve system, and you can think of the sympathetic, if you're not sure, as the fight or flight kind of aspect of the nerve system. And the parasympathetic is maybe how you feel after a big Thanksgiving dinner, and it's kind of calming things down and so on too. But people tended to think of it as like a kind of a dimmer up and down switch, that if the parasympathetic system is going on, then the sympathetic system depresses and so on. But with some of this Keltner studies, he's been finding that different responses occur in different ways. They started hooking people up to these sensors, and they asked them questions that were prideful questions. When did you feel a sense of pride in something? And then they had them answer questions that showed that the sympathetic system was somewhat depressed, but the parasympathetic system was becoming more in action. They were kind of reflecting and thinking about things. When they talked about romance or something like that, then this parasympathetic would go up. But when they talked about awe, both the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system both dropped measurably, both responses. And that has some real interesting aspects to it too. So they've been studying not only the emotional aspect of it all, but also the physiological aspects of it all, and also maybe I'll talk a little bit later about the cognitive aspects of awe and what awe does in terms of expanding your intelligence, your knowledge of things.
Mike, you mentioned earlier about the vastness of awe.
Yeah.
And you were trying to think, you know, where are the limits to that and what's vast? And what came to me right away was awe is vast experientially. In other words, if I've experienced it, I'll never experience having a baby, okay? And if you have a baby once, it may be awesome every time, but if you have 3 or 4, you know, you get to know the lay of the land. The astronauts who've been to the, but I can't speak for a woman, I might be wrong, you know, maybe after 6 it's still the same feeling, I don't know. But I would think astronauts that have been up on the capsule a couple times or 3 times, sure, it's awesome, but the experiential limits have been set. And I think the reason that religion evolved was because the things that were presented to us were beyond our experience. Listening to a huge organ in a huge church for the first time, you know, people would quake because they had never experienced it.
Yeah.
Well, so the one piece I would, I don't disagree with you. I actually think that, yeah, there's a lot of truth to what you just said. And I want to name that for especially a lot of Eastern religions, mindfulness is something that is about cultivating that awe in your daily life, right? And so, I remember reading one author, I cannot remember their name, but they talked about how in the process of washing dishes, for instance, being completely mindful of the slipperiness of the soap and the bubbles and the hot water and the temperature, right? In that moment, there is a center of awe. So I have no doubt that we get desensitized. And part of what many religious institutions and just philosophies try to is that they advocate for continuing practices that keep you awake and aware of mindfulness is a way to cultivate awe, right? So yes, we get desensitized, and yet I don't think that that's the end of the story. I think that there is still the possibility that in that desensitized state, we can continue to cultivate awe. Maybe not in the same way, maybe it's different, and I think by your second baby, you're probably still in awe that, look, this child has a completely different personality
right?
than the first one, right? And that's about us doing our dishes, right? And being mindful of the bees and the butterflies outside in the garden. That's not something that you always have, but you cultivate.
Well, that
There's a
ties
lot of-
back to brain science with the notion of habituation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That certain neural pathways, as they're exercised more, they engender less of an emotional response. It ties back to the concept of surprise as being a factor of awe that we were talking about before. One of my favorite awesome moments actually involved Joanne. Joanne knew intellectually that the planet Saturn had rings, right? We all learned that in school, but the first time she looked through a telescope, she was almost brought to tears, if I remember correctly, by actually seeing it, the emotional effect of integrating that into your worldview in a brand new way. That surprise is still there. Now, I've seen the rings of Saturn through a telescope hundreds of times, and it is no longer awesome to me, but is still wonderful.
Right. I wanted to see if I can, I thought I'd throw in some potentially awesome pictures once in a while in my slides there. That's kind of a nice one.
There's a question too.
Okay, let me get some types of awe that we were talking about. There's a visual awe, the simpler beauty-based experiences like the picture we just saw, or the rings of Saturn and so on. Sometimes disintegration or chaos, trauma and so on can cause awe. You can just be completely unable to process the fact that this town is no longer there or something like that in the event of a tornado or a mudslide or things like that. And some, I'd call it transformative awe, where you see some acts of service or compassion that are just beyond your capacity to really process at that minute. So I don't know if there's, that was, as I was trying to put down some areas of talking about it too, and trying not to just force us into the visual awe things, but trying to look at some of these others to talk about as well too. So I thought I'd put that up.
I was thinking that a lot of this it's very subjective, my subjective definition of the words and definition of the distinction between awe and wonder. But when I think of awe, I think of something that I witness that is incomprehensible, or that I think of that is incomprehensible to me. And I think when awe becomes comprehensible, then maybe it becomes wonder, because I can experience the Grand Canyon over and over again, and I can still feel that sense of wonder, but I don't feel a sense of awe once I understand what it is that that I'm thinking about, that I'm looking at.
I think it's more than just
I think awe
intellectual.
stays awesome until you understand it. And once you understand it, it's not quite so awesome anymore. It can still be wonderful and amazing.
Mhm.
But, you know, I can think of, I can think of things that I really don't understand how they could be. And I find that awesome. And it keeps me wondering, and it keeps me curious. And maybe it motivates me more to think more about it. So I guess my thought is that once awe becomes comprehended, it becomes less awesome, and perhaps that's what wonder is.
Although you
We
may be able to
experience.
compartmentalize and say that portions of that are not awe-filling to you, awesome to you anymore, yet there are still aspects of it that still maintain a level of awesomeness, this or that aspect of it, like we're talking about the birth or whatever too. And I'm wondering, is awe, what's the purpose of awe? And if there is a purpose, is it of value? Should we cultivate it? Can we cultivate awe? And you can also talk about wonder in those things as well too. So some of those thoughts I had in terms of what goes on.
I like that you have transformative awe on there, because I think that's probably one of the most powerful types of awe. And I have to say that I have experienced transformative awe quite a bit, especially once I've been aware of it, especially in relationship with other people. I have a theory. It's totally a theory, but where two people hit each other, and I don't mean physically, I mean that you mesh with each other. You are on the same page. It may be awe-inspiring. It may not be in of itself, but where those moments of connection happen, that is where the transcendent becomes imminent. That is where the unexplainable allows us to actually be powerful together and create a relationship. And so that is what I have experienced as transformative awe. And I experience it almost weekly with members of this congregation.
I was just gonna say, now I want an example.
Let's do it.
But you know, so think about it this way. Have you ever been in an argument with someone, and then all of a sudden, through that discussion, you get on the same page? You get into a place where you're like, oh, I've been saying this, you've been saying that, but together we can actually say this, and we can fix this argument to actually be useful. That is transformative
You're
awe,
not supposed
in
to
my
just
opinion.
dig in your heels? That's an awesome realization right there for me. I thought you were just supposed to win.
No.
Oh.
No. So that's how I would define. I mean, sometimes transformative awe can be much larger, but I think it can be an everyday experience where we just align with one another into relationship that is deeper and more inspiring for each other.
Okay, nice.
Oh.
Mary? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that I didn't have a name for that until you named it. But I tend to resonate with what you're saying, Mandy, because it's sort of like that's really can be the core of really healthy relationships. And the purpose of it, I think who you quoted was Thich Nhat Hanh about the dishes.
That could be yes.
Because his whole thing is be present to whatever you're doing.
Right.
Be aware, be present, be alive there, not in the future and not in the past. And we're there so much. So what's the purpose of awe maybe is to help us learn to stay present to each other, to nature, to the world, to where we are. Because if we're not present, we miss the moments of awe. We miss that aliveness.
That was very well articulated, Mary. Yes, I'd agree with all of that.
I'll add a little bit more to that. 2 weeks ago, we were in the Monte Verde Cloud Forest, and we had 2 wonderful experiences with a guide, and we saw so much, but then we were out on our own and could hardly see anything.
Is that in
you know.
Argentina, South America?
In Costa Rica.
Costa Rica, okay.
And then we started to take these mindful moments on our hike, and we would just freeze and look at something. And it was just amazing what you could see but otherwise, you're just kind of like hustling along the trail, you know. So I think I would reinforce that too about maybe some purpose of, or in our pursuit of happiness. Perhaps we never really appreciate happiness is really at these slowing down and taking time for these deeper moments, I think, and appreciating it. But because you know, you can get, I had made a note earlier about getting caught up in grasping for what's the next big place we can go to see something big, and you know, and what's the next adventure that's going to be awesome, you know. But it's all in the simple stuff, I think.
Right.
Or a
And
lot can be in the simple stuff.
I like that, and I like that you brought in happiness, because actually one of the interesting things in psychology is that people are the most happy when they have had trouble and then had it resolved. We're not actually in bliss when good things happen in the same way as when we've had trouble and then resolved it. That is actually a happier moment for us than just good moments. And so I love that you brought happiness in there, because it's not working your way through a problem and then finding a solution a moment of awe. I find it is. I mean, maybe not in the same deep way that you experienced the Grand Canyon the first time you've seen it, but there is something in that moment where you've learned something more about yourself that is awe-filled.
Yeah, just to continue that, you know, I think it's very helpful that when you're talking about these to really think in terms of kind of secular, you know, natural selection processes that, you know, really allow us to have these abilities.
That's where you wanted to go next, right?
Soon.
Maybe I'll hold off on that because, you know, when we start talking about transcendence and things like that, we can get off in kind of supernatural thinking that we think is really not helpful for people, and that we really want to really try to really think about how, you know, secular, you know, scientific explanations are really much more helpful in us, you know, kind of analyzing and using these things for our daily lives.
I think we can skirt around and talk about any of it, but I tend to try to put a scientific balance to it, a scientific purpose to it. Hello.
Yesterday I had breakfast with a friend of mine. I've known him about 12 years. We've both been through some personal challenges. We've helped each other over the years. And I've always known that his leanings politically are much different than mine, okay? But yesterday, for some reason, he opened up like a gusher. And I got a hose full of right-wing extremist conspiracy stuff. And the coffee is long cold, but the conversation was hot. But the thing is, I never said a word about what I believe. I just let him talk. And I know this guy very well. And what was awesome to me was near the end of the conversation, everything you've ever heard from the far right, he had it all down. Every phrase, I don't know what to call him. And I mean, he was so familiar. And it's like he earnestly believed in this. And I thought to myself as this was going on, and I got more and more content, and I said, I don't care what he believes. I really love this guy. And I want to talk to him again.
I had a good breakfast with you too.
To me, that was an awesome moment.
Yeah.
Yes.
That our political differences did not matter because we had other commonalities that made us appreciate each other. And you know what? If I could talk to 3 people a week like that, maybe there's hope.
Yeah.
You know, if we could, I keep hearing, how do you cross the divide politically? Because we're so divided in this country. I think I did it yesterday, but he never knew how I thought, which is okay. It's a start.
It's a start.
It's a start. Yeah.
Sherry, did you have something?
I know that some of us have said that you know, the moments that are awe-inspiring or awesome are ones that we've not experienced before. But as I look at this from the way, you know, I'm thinking back and reflecting, sometimes some of the most awesome moments are, for me, are seeing things in a different way. So we
people have been mentioning a couple times the purposes of awe, and I wanted to note some of these down that seems like this Dr. Keltner has developed. Awe moments take you from a self-interest to a collective interest, and he's done studies in which they've shown pictures of some things to people, shown pictures of negative things to people, shown pictures of neutral incidents to people, and then they ask questions about them later, ask questions of the people that saw these pictures. And there's a consistent development in that people that have seen awesome or have been involved in an awe-inspiring moment are much more involved in the collective group thought. They're much taken out of themselves. They have lost their self-interest. They'll answer questionnaires in which they show much more concern about what other people are thinking.
Mm-hmm.
They've done things like show one group a picture. They took on the campus of Berkeley, there's some, I think, eucalyptus trees that are supposedly 200 feet high and very awesome. I haven't seen them, but they took a group of people to look at these eucalyptus trees. And then they had another group of people look at the science building, which is rather drab, which is a shame. But I think the science building ought to look awesome, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So anyways, they had them look at the building, a group, and as they were looking at the building, by chance, a person came by and dropped a whole bowl, a whole folder of pens. A bunch of pens fell on the ground. And they saw that the people that had been in the eucalyptus grove looking up at things for, 30 seconds before that were much more willing to help pick up all these pens that were scattered on the ground rather than the people in front of the science building. And all sorts of different experiences like that. So there's a much more, again, the second, from an isolated self to an integrated self, not focusing in so much on just your own world and you. Being aware, being involved in awesome events breaks down the us versus them thinking. So kind of what Russ was saying there in that incident, that even though you didn't say a word, you were breaking down us and them right then.
This answers your question. Vastness. The
Mhm.
vastness of awe is that you go beyond yourself.
Right.
Right? That you go into the collective. And I'm thinking here again of Degrassi Tyson's like Stardust quote, where he talks about how most people look at the cosmos and feel small, but he feels big. That's exactly it. We feel big. We feel part of something, that we feel connectivity, that we are together. That's the vastness.
Or it's a sense of smallness, but a smallness as part of something big
That's bigger.
that you're comfortable being with and in.
Yeah.
And the other thing, it increases curiosity. So now if you think of a group of primitive people that have now been seeing awesome things, if they can define it as awesome in their mind, and they're moving from self-interest to collective interest, is that helpful to that group of primitive people living, 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago? It seems pretty obvious that it is. Then you start working to make your band, your tribe more effective, more successful, right? You're willing to give things up for the benefit of the tribe.
So one of the things that occurs to me is that it's not necessarily true that all of the capacities we have evolved for the purpose with which we express them, or the context in which we express them. So for example, if the concept or the capability for awe evolved in a social context to help us feel more integrated, I think that when people sing together, or when they march together, or engage in collective action,
We should do that at church sometime, don't you think, man?
that's a good idea. Maybe a music director might. The sense, the emotional sense that engenders in a person is very pro-social. But evolution isn't goal-directed, right? Evolution didn't build that into us so that we could sing together, so that we could march together, so that we could appreciate the Grand Canyon. A lot of these are capacities that have had some evolutionary benefit, but the capacity can be expressed in ways that have nothing to do with survival. It's just because we have the capacity, they can be leveraged in novel contexts. Like the ability to see, right? There's huge benefits in the ability to be able to see and distinguish small objects in our field of view, small snakes or a stinging animal
Scorpion.
or a scorpion or something. But the ability to have an eye that can distinguish fine detail also enabled us to be able to read and write, right? So evolution didn't necessarily build into the human capacity, the spectrum of human capacities, an innate tendency to read and write. Certainly language, but that's separate. So I think that sometimes we get lost in this idea of pursuing what's the evolutionary benefit of being awed by the Grand Canyon. That's probably not it. It's probably just an evolutionary capability to feel part of something bigger. Maybe the advantage was purely in a social context, but that circuitry, that capacity still exists in us, and it can be leveraged in many ways.
Right, but the fact that, to me, I think the point I'm making is that if awe is a capacity that, as far as I know, only humans have, that capacity has put us on a certain path. That we get benefits from it, we get challenges, things occur, but when you are living in an environment where the awe-inspiring things come in, and the result of that is a more social environment, you're going to be a more social creature that may then, the result, the more successful communities of primitive people may have been the people that the awe was able to inspire them and have other knock-off effects.
More collective
Right.
success.
But they
right?
were collectively successful, maybe more safe, they were able to hunt more efficiently, do the different things.
Well, and
the
it
other thing-
cultivates curiosity too,
Yeah.
right? That's part
Right.
of that, because then they want to explain this awe-inspiring
And explore it
thing.
as well too.
Yes.
If you're at the end of a valley and you look and you see something down
Right.
ahead, way ahead, and you have curiosity and you're awed by it, there's a reason to go exploring, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so the traveling and the expansion of society may have some level of impact from awe as well.
I thought of a good analogy. We haven't evolved to watch television,
Right.
right? But watching television can elicit in us a sense of community, a sense of empathy, a sense of being engaged with other people that are just fictions, right? On theater, right? Theater to television to reading a story. We have these capacities that have evolved for pro-social ends from an evolutionary standpoint, but we're able to leverage them to enrich our lives immeasurably more than just their evolved context.
Right, it's a hard thing to say. Did this initial development of awe long ago cause all these other things, or did all those other things help create awe to be nurtured and go on from there? And when we finally had a language to describe it, then we call it awe.
If we find an alien species that is not social, if it's more like certain animal species on the earth that are more solitary, it'd be interesting to see if their evolutionary path led them to the same capacity for feeling a connectedness and the Gestalt kind of sense. James, I think you've studied some of this, haven't you, with some of your research about collective capacities that people have?
Oh, yeah, Scott, I did want to follow up with you saying, just thinking about the evolution of our abilities, our, psychological abilities. The recent arguments, particularly from the Harvard Professor Wrangham, that virtually all the paleoanthropologists and so forth have agreed that all of our psychological abilities evolved before the end of the last ice age, the end of the late Pleistocene. And, Picasso was really good about that. He said he went into the cave art that was done before, and he came out and said, look, this is the best art that's ever been done in history since then. So these people, before the end of the last ice age, this ancient period, really had all of our abilities, and that's kind of really agreed upon. And it's the idea that what were the selection processes that were going on in this late Pleistocene, before the end of the last ice age, to cause the evolution of our psychological abilities. And of course, these are the first cultures that existed with language, as sort of the idea that language brought in these new selection processes that ended up making us so much different than all the rest of the animals. But
That's amazing.
But the idea that really like awe and our aesthetic abilities really evolved before the end of the last ice age under these unique selection processes of the hunter-gatherers.
Even though the human species had been around for a couple 100,000 years prior to that.
Right.
Yeah, interesting.
See, I'm trying to get back to one, I think I went past. Here's a statement Albert Einstein wrote. The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed.
I love that, and I think that please hear me. I want to understand where awe and wonder come from, because it is so important. It is very clear that it is vital to understanding our collective movement in history, and I actually think that it's even more vital that we continue to cultivate it, that we, and I've shared this, I think both with you, Mike, and with you, Scott, in other previous conversations I've had with you, is that if we only rely on our brain, we can rationalize the hell out of everything. And rationalizing the hell out of everything can lead to some very, very dark roads. I mean,
Eugenics.
Eugenics
Right,
is part of our own Unitarian history. But, think about Nazi Germany, right? Think about Trump's logic and the logic of the right. These are all ways that we've used logic in ways that are harmful to people. In Taoism, there is no head without the heart. There's no word for head alone, for brain, for mind, without the heart. And that's, I think, exactly what Albert Einstein is writing here, right? Is that, we have to have both of those pieces, because they are about how we are connected with one another.
When you think of the time and effort he spent developing amazing theories and the math that went into it and all the development there, but for him to come back to this and this be a core to him, even though he's not this lost science man that only cares about figures and facts and so on, and that's a good thing to emulate.
Yeah.
Randy?
I'm happy that you're bringing up the Center for Greater Good, and one of their mailings this week, they had a list of 20 pro-social movies, and saying that so much of what's inflicted on us is sort of a degradation of awe and wonder. It's just the baser human instincts, and they're working so hard, I think, to try to to pull us back into this space. I mean, and it seems like it really has to be a cultural context, a normative context that starts dignifying and celebrating it again, and we're so lost from it, as evidenced by the Trump logic,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was thinking scientists have studied human responses to awe and have noted subjective responses, physiological responses, and even cognitive responses. They did one where they told people about a 5-minute story, and they told either a neutral story or an awe-inspiring story, and then they told a group a romantic story. So they talked about a romantic dinner. And so they went through, and I should have prepared it, but it would take too long. But they told about a 5-minute vignette to people that talked about a very romantic dinner, and they went through this whole process, and people were visualizing it and so on. And then they asked them questions at the end of it, and so they were cognitive questions. And for example, a question would be, were there candles on the table at this romantic dinner? And a high proportion of people said yes. They specifically didn't put anything about candles in the dinner, showing that people's heuristics, people's way of looking at things, they impose their sense of understanding what a romantic dinner means by putting candles on this table. And so they imagined this whole story. They could see it. They could not answer cognitive questions that were away from what their normal perception of what a romantic dinner could be. So their cognitive levels dropped down. They also told people some neutral story that didn't mean much, and they had a baseline of cognitive understanding from that. And they told people these awe-inspiring stories. And the awe-inspiring stories, when they asked questions about it, their cognitive level was significantly higher than either of the other two cases. And what's that was the parasympathetic nerve response was going up as the sympathetic nerve response was going, I'm sorry, they were both going down. They were deflating so much that people could concentrate on the cognitive aspect of what was going on. This story was just a new awe-inspiring story that created a very cognitive picture of what was going on in this story. So it's kind of interesting to see, and the different studies that they've been doing about all this. And so it's shown that it increases cognitive, increases physiological responses, and is valuable in all those ways. And I guess one aspect is it important to get awe into your life?
You know, that kind of also answers the vastness question too, right? Because what you're saying is when the stories were shared about awe-inspiring moments, there's almost like an openness in our mind because we cannot imagine. There's that mystery, right? Which means you're open to curiosity, to new beginnings, to possibilities you had never considered before. Whereas a very clear idea of romance is like, oh no, I know exactly what that looks like.
Right.
But when you put, and that openness is its own sense of vastness.
Right, which exercises the mind and exercises your imagination
Yeah.
and so on too. So, yeah, to me, it seems like it's a pretty straightforward jump to say that it's good to get awe-inspiring situations in your mind. I know, Carl Nash, you've traveled to all the national parks in the U.S., right? And sometimes they add a new national park, and then you got your work cut out for you again, too, right? But
I think surprise is a big part of that. You know, we tend to become complacent to experience
Yeah.
as we mature. And if it occurred to me that if the romantic story you were alluding to, if there had been a talking frog sitting on the table as part of the story, nobody would have forgotten the fact that there was a talking frog in the story, because it completely would defy expectations and the norms that we expect in a romantic setting, right? So I think in terms of cultivating awe, one of the things that goes hand in hand with that is cultivating new experiences and surprise in a safe, certainly, in a safe
I
way.
was jumping on that, saying, well, I was thinking that you talk about the talking frog in a romantic story, and you think obviously the princess that kisses the frog,
Frog,
right?
yeah.
But so it could even be in that story, and you might say it was a talking amphibian, or you might say talking toad or something. But people would remember talking frog because even if
Yeah.
it was a romantic story,
Just say
the difference-
reptile and they'll think
Right.
it's a frog.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
a snake, or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's
There's a
interesting.
question.
Just an observation. There's a lot of subjectivity in all of the words and linguistics we use to describe the feelings of awe and wonder and how we get to them. And I think it's an interesting, there is an objective story out there of experiencing awe, which is a fairly subjective experience. And what I'm thinking of is the astronaut story, which is the astronauts who go to the moon, go out, generally out in space, and look back at the little blue planet that
The
they live on.
overlook effect is
And
what
then
it's
they
called.
look at the vastness of the universe, come back changed in some way from that experience. And that's not an exception, it's the rule, that they experience something awesome as a rule when they go up and they look back at this planet and the nature they live in, and they look at all of space beyond it. And so I just think it's an interesting thing. It's an objective example of a subjective experience.
Mhm.
And it's the rule of people who experience it.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, they tend to come back, first of all, realizing how small they are. There's the pale blue dot, right, that's seen, I think, from Voyager.
Voyager, yeah.
From millions of miles away, and people realize that all of humanity's struggles and all of life's issues on Earth, occurred on that pale blue dot, and the compassion that comes from that, the realization of how you have to nurture it and take care of it and so on, is a awesome, awe-inspiring kind of experience. And I've heard too how many astronauts come back just from seeing, and they haven't seen it in that venue, but seeing the Earth and seeing, they lose this capacity for seeing divisions and
Right.
differences and so on.
I've long had this idea that the UN should pay for every world leader to go up into a capsule and experience the overlook effect.
Right.
Yeah.
Should they all come back?
Well, but I think this is kind of where you're getting to with the science that you're talking about here, Mike, is that, our interpretation of these awe-inspiring moments are certainly subjective. But I'm wondering, and this is something that the research will continue to tell us, is whether the physical response to these awe-inspiring moments are actually objective. That is, that they are similar across all peoples,
right.
right?
Tune into the next Science
Tune
Sunday
into
where
the
I'll
next
talk-
time.
where I'm going to talk about brain responses and similarities.
One thing I just wanted to see is awe religious, or has it ever been? Is awe religious? Is maybe the first.
Exclusively, you mean, or what Venn diagram are you referring to?
But I just wanted to throw out the
Okay.
idea and have you.
Well, I think that religion is a method by which we make meaning of the world. So science could be a religion in my book, under my interpretation. And for that, yes, it is religious, but it isn't simply religious. It's beyond that as well.
Okay.
That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, there's several religiously oriented humanists who very much agree with that we all have a religion, whether it's a secular religion or a supernatural religion. It's the way we look at the world and the way we incorporate the awesome things that we behold into our view of the cosmos, our cosmography.
Yeah.
I kind of felt like religion grabbed for this awe and used it to explain things and was the only explanation for a while. And I see a commonality between science and religion. Both are trying to explain awe-inspiring things or awesome things in our world. I see some differences too.
Yes.
But, so I'd say that awe used to be the venue, the purvey of religion.
Exclusively.
Yes.
first, yeah.
Yes, used to be, but I would definitely not say that's true
Yeah.
any longer.
And now, as we expand and grow as humans and look at new ways of the world and so on, I would say that awe is becoming more universal than
Yeah.
religious.
I would agree.
Involved, as you know, with my writings, I get involved with sentience, awe, and wonder as the big three. And I have to agree with John in some regards regarding awe. Something which can't be done anymore, but those of us who are somewhat older remember a summer night when you could lie out there and there was no light. This night was black, and there were little dots up there. And if you just stayed there long enough, all of a sudden they came into focus. And you went, oh, because the universe is huge, is beyond imagination, and you saw it. You saw it in your own mind, in your own eyes, and you went, oh.
And you could feel like you were floating in
And
this
you
vastness.
felt tiny,
Right.
and you felt helpless, and you felt powerless in the face of powers and strengths that were beyond you, and that at any moment, something could come along and wipe you out, and no one else in the universe would even know that you existed. I used to do this in my classes. What would happen if the Earth simply disappeared? Who would notice?
Right.
And the answer is nobody. Nobody at all.
That's one of the reasons I wrote about the human multiverse is,
And to me, that's awe. That's where the whole thing, and it also brings into that thing, that fear, that gut-wrenching fear. I am completely helpless. There's nothing I can do about it. Oh my goodness gracious. And now we get to the God part. Whereas wonder to me is the other side of the coin. As a scientist, I wander around the world going, wow, look at that. Hokey smokes. Did you see that? I wonder how, who, what, why, when, where, how.
Mm-hmm.
That's wonder to me. And so I differentiate the two of them very, very strongly. They're both emotions. They have no sentience involved in it. There's no thought process. It's strictly emotion. But one of them is, holy crap, I could get killed any second now. Couldn't do anything about it. And the other is, wow, look at that, will you? And much of what we discussed today, I think, goes across that border. We mix the words, we mix the meanings. We have not kept them separate.
Yeah, no, I think that there is some bleeding across. So if awe, as I perceive it, is something that we should nurture, are there ways that you can do it? You know, and what do you make a way of adding awe into your life?
So I think that this is where like mindfulness practices in the Eastern traditions are really, really helpful, right? I think it's also one of those moments or in your day where you pull yourselves out. So Minister Speak has this idea that you get up on the balcony, right? So think about a church. You're in the balcony, which means you can see everything around it. We usually use it in organizational theory, but it's the same thing about our everyday life. Like, can you pull yourself out of the dishwashing moment or pull yourself into the dishwashing moment? Either of those acts of seeing the bigger picture or being in the moment are going to cultivate awe and wonder. I'm gonna go home and dig in my garden and get dirty, and you better bet that I'm going to notice every little thing that's in my garden dirt, that's all around me, and the noise of the birds after being inside in the winter. Will I have that same feeling come August when it's 95 degrees outside and I just need to weed and get done with it? I don't know. But I know that I will in this moment, today. And so part of it, I think, is just opening our minds, allowing ourselves to be present in that vastness. And that can be done just by, I think, mentally being in the moment, but I actually think that mindfulness practices actually allow us to do that. That they cultivate, to your point, that habitual response to our bodies and our minds.
well, and I would add to that, seeking out novelty is another way. Being mindful of where you are and what's awesome about the things within your purview is useful, but sometimes putting yourself in a new context where you're more likely to find something novel, I think can help.
Yeah.
I just wrote down a few, just kind of, it might be interesting for you to do that too when you get home. Write down what you think are ways that you can add awe into your life. I said taking a walk, deliberate habits of singing or dancing or poetry. Relive moments of awe that you've already had. If you relive them, remember that moment and think about it. Put yourself back in that space. Sometimes take the scenic route. My wife doesn't go for that one. Seeing David Attenborough or Carl Sagan do their Planet Earth or Cosmos series are just phenomenally great capacities for seeing things that bring you back to a point of awe. And I thought you should bring awe to work. If you have something that reminds you of something awesome, I have a poster of Zion National Park, Angels Landing, and I walked up there with my two daughters when the younger one turned 21, and we hiked to the top. And I have a poster of that at work, and it's very meaningful to me too. And stretch your comfort zone. Go on little micro adventures, call up a park and see if there's an open camping spot tonight or something like that. And sometimes they just have like a few open spots. So you go there and maybe there's nothing there, but maybe there is. Odd journaling and things like that are possible too. Write down odd awesome issues or awesome thoughts that you had. Okay,
Maybe cultivate curiosity.
yeah.
Yeah.
And
Don't
this-
assume you know the answer, right?
Right, and this summer, by the way, now that the pandemic is not as dangerous as it was, I plan to open my house once again this summer to have a telescope viewing. So if you haven't seen the Rings of Saturn
Or Joanne Cry.
or Joanne Cry, come on by, and or the moons of Jupiter, right?
Yeah.
So.
Mary, final things?
I just wanted to talk about a very simple, inexpensive a way to reconnect yourself with awe, and that is to rent or take or something, a 2.5 or 3-year-old child. by
Rent
the
a
hand.
2-year-old?
2.5 to 3-year-old child for a walk. Take them by the hand and let them be in charge of the walk. My youngest of 3 daughters got me a realization of that when she was that age, and she's now just turned 54 years old. But I remember walking with her and my grandchildren too, but just they stop, if you let them lead the walk, they stop every 10 seconds because, look, Mommy, look, and it'll be an ant crawling on the ground, and they want to watch that ant. I mean, it just open you up to the moment and to what we miss. And that's a cheap way to get reconnected with awe.
Nice.
Well, I think there's a curiosity, and they don't have the answers, right? They can't explain what's going on, so it's all new and
Yes.
and
Remind us the
awe-inspiring.
value of starting anew.
Yeah.
You know, each day being open to all that. We lose it right away.
Yeah, agree.
Well, we need to end up, we've gone over a little bit, I appreciate very much. I did put sources here, and I was rushing this morning, and it's a lot smaller than I wish it would be, but maybe you can see it well enough to see that. All interesting people to try to get some ideas about awe, and hope you bring more awe into your life. Thank you very much for
Thank
participating.
you.
We
Thank
loved
you
it.
for having me.
It was an awesome program.
Yeah, thank you.